In this video, we have a special guest. His name is Nick. He's a full-stack software engineer and also a Docker captain. In this video specifically, we're going to talk about how he became a software developer and how he transitioned from software developer to a operation or a DevOps engineer. And we're also going to talk about what's the learning path for learning about Docker, how to be proficient using Docker, and what's the career path for someone who's trying to get into being a DevOps engineer. What's the transition look like? What are some challenges and benefits for being a DevOps engineer? So Nick, welcome to the show, and please introduce yourself to the audience.
Hey, my name is Nick Janetakis, and I'm a freelance developer who's been at this for about 20 years now. So over the years, I've just been building and deploying all sorts of different web applications.
So Nick, can you tell us a bit more about your development journey? How did you get started? What did you do?
I started programming back in 1997 with Visual Basic 6. So back then I was still in high school. I had just got my first computer. My parents weren't into programming, so this was something that I just picked up on my own. So shortly after discovering the internet, there was all sorts of different chat rooms that I used to go on to. There was Yahoo Chat, AOL, and a couple other ones. And I noticed that certain folks in those chat rooms were able to do very cool things, at least cool for me back in the day, where, you know, they can knock people offline, they can spam the channel, doing all sorts of different things. And that is something that I wanted to do. So that was basically my first use case of like, okay, I want to do that. Like, what do I need to learn to do that? And yeah, I eventually just learned that a lot of these programs were written with Visual Basic 6. So I was able to download Visual Basic 6, the IDE basically. And yeah, I just started going through the documentation, just teaching myself to program. It was just a ton of trial and error. Back then, you know, Google wasn't a thing. It was really hard to find information. But, you know, eventually I kind of just assimilated myself into the community around folks doing that type of tooling. And I picked up all sorts of tricks and tips and just kept writing little programs and, you know, trying to improve it and learn new stuff. And moving on after Visual Basic 6, I wanted to create my first website. And back then GeoCities just came around. And this was a really good platform to basically host your own website. And it was free, easy to get going. I basically learned some HTML. So that was really fun, where I had a personal site where, you know, I just listed my favorite metal bands and some of the programs that I created. And of course I had like an under construction sign because that was a very popular thing to do, along with having like Netscape and Navigator buttons. And I'm pretty sure I even had something like the Exorcist theme playing in the background as a MIDI track. So that's like MIDI, like old school stuff. It was really fun. And after that, I started playing a video game called Quake 3. Now, this is about maybe year 2000-ish. I was just about to graduate high school. And yeah, so a friend and I were playing Quake 3 a lot. And it was very competitive. It was a very competitive game. And we basically joined a clan together, basically a group of us. And we would play other groups of people, like 4-on-4, basically. And we wanted to create a gaming ladder where different teams can compete against each other and they would get ranked. And yeah, so that was basically building my first SaaS application. Now, my friend, who was a remote friend, like we just met playing Quake basically, he did all the programming for that with ASP Classic, where I did all of the design. So the whole design of the site was basically something I did, whereas he did all the programming backend aspects of it, like working with a database and doing all the logic. And that ended up being sort of kind of successful. I mean, I forget exact details, but I think something like 12,000 people signed up for that. Totally free, but it was like a great project just to get my feet wet with like, okay, we actually built something real and we hosted it because one of our other clan members actually ran like an internet hosting company. So we were able to get a server for free. So that was awesome. And that really got my foot in the door when it came to just, you know, building websites and web applications. And actually, there were a number of different clan members or other people that played the game where they were like, oh, cool, like you made that one site, like, can you make us a site? So I found myself doing freelance work like really early on, where a lot of it I was actually just making these clan sites, like these websites for other teams for free, just because it was like super fun. I got to kind of practice my trade. But I did get a couple of paid gigs from that one, and that was really fun. But besides that, you know, eventually, I don't know how long this is going to be, but yeah, I started to just develop more web apps as time went on. I started learning a little bit more about PHP, you know, looking into like different web frameworks and stuff. And I also started looking into a programming language called Ruby. So I did eventually get into Ruby on Rails, but I did start very late in that regard. I started using Ruby on Rails back in version 4. I don't know exactly what year that was, maybe 2013, 2014, give or take, in that neighborhood. But yeah, so I started creating SaaS applications for some clients there. And that was really very eye-opening, like developing a big web application with Ruby on Rails versus just like putting together a WordPress site or, some homegrown PHP site. But yeah, besides Rails and Flask, yeah, I just kept building and building and building. And, sometime around, 2014 or 15, I really started getting into using Linux and just learning a lot more about just how Linux works in general, different distros, hosting, shell scripting, and eventually stumbled into using Ansible for configuration management for setting up different servers. And also in 2015, I got my first introduction to Docker. And yeah, I just started using Docker to help just set up all the web applications that I've been building. And it made it so much easier for me to not only just build them locally on my machine, but then when it came time to packaging up the application like a Rails app or a Flask app and giving it to a client to run, it was very easy for them to run it. And then it was also very easy to deploy it and run it on a Linux server.
Wow, so this is some interesting story you got here. So now, speaking of Docker, how did you become a Docker captain? What was the process like?
A couple of months after I started using Docker, I found myself wanting to just share all the information I've been learning about everything on my own personal site. So I ended up starting nickjanetakis.com, where, I kind of just blog and create YouTube videos about everything I'm learning along the way. And when it came to Docker, I just found myself writing about, various different Docker topics that I've learned along the way, how I'm applying them to real projects and stuff like that. And what ended up happening in terms of being a Docker captain is Docker reached out to me over email. And they were like, hey, Nick, by the way, I've been reading some of your blog posts, or we've been reading some of your blog posts, and we have this Docker Captains program that we're introducing, and we would like you to be a part of it. And, we basically had a couple of different back and forth emails going about explaining, what that would mean to be a Docker captain. And basically the TLDR is that, Docker invited me as a Docker captain. And, it's not like I'm working for Docker, they don't pay me. I'm not like an employee or anything like that. But it's really nice because I have basically an inside look at Docker itself in terms of, access to their developers and a little bit of inside information and stuff like that. I basically get to test things out maybe before they get released to give some feedback. And, then I get to share everything I learn along the way, publicly out in the open when Docker is ready to, announce whatever they're working on and stuff like that. So, I've been a Docker captain now since I think it was 2016, may have been 2015, it's basically in that time frame.
That's amazing. I mean, they even reached out to you to talk about the Docker Captain program. Can you tell us a bit more about learning Docker? What's the learning path to learn about Docker? Try to get good at using Docker. Do you have any suggestions or any recommendation?
There's definitely lots of ways you can go about learning Docker. I think maybe now, in 2022, the ecosystem and general availability of learning material is a lot different than back in 2015 when Docker was very new. So for me, and I don't know if this really ties into basically how I started programming too, but when it came to learning Docker, it was just going through the documentation, downloading the tools and just running them locally and experimenting with things until I figured out basically my own best practices or, ways to get things to work in ways that I really liked and they were portable and my clients liked them. And yeah, so, I mean, nowadays you can choose to take the same route, right? You can go through their documentation. At this point in time, their docs are way, way, way better now than they were back in the day because, like anything and everyone, you improve as time goes on. You learn more information. So they were able to refine their docs to now, yeah, it could probably be pretty comfortable just to go through their docs to learn Docker. But yeah, I mean, there's thousands of blog posts, thousands of YouTube videos, a whole bunch of different Docker courses. There's basically limitless potential there. And, I don't just want to plug my own stuff, but, on nickjanetakis.com/blog, I do have a Docker section there with I don't know, something like 120 different free posts about Docker. Some of them are videos as well. I also have a dive into docker.com video course. It is a paid course, but it takes you basically from the beginning all the way to the end of what the heck is Docker to comfortably running various different web apps through Docker Compose, basically a tool that helps you run multiple containers together. And, we get into the gory details about that. But yeah, I feel like you can probably pick up Docker pretty quickly now. Quickly in the sense that, like, you know, it's not something where you're going to have to like stop your life for 6 months. If you're an experienced developer, I think you can get the basics down to the point where you're feeling pretty comfortable, you know, in a matter of weeks, potentially less if you use some like guided learning resources.
I see. Now, speaking of applying the things that you learn in Docker, can you tell us a bit more about the career path? You know, after someone who get good at using Docker, what are some of the job opportunities that are available?
Wow, there is unlimited potential here when it comes to different career paths, right? This is such a broad topic. And when it comes to something like Docker, what's really interesting about this is the information that you learn about Docker tends to carry over to various different technologies. Like, for example, you know, I have example Dockerized web apps on GitHub for, let's see, Flask, Django, Rails, Phoenix, Node, and Play. And the Docker components of those are all very, very similar. Minor differences, you know, depending on what language I'm using, etc. But where I'm going with this one is it makes your skill set very portable to finding different career paths. Like, you know, you can decide that you want to do some short-term contract work, maybe long-term contract work, maybe you want to join a company. But what's really interesting is you kind of have an open door to join a company using basically any tech stack. So yeah, there's very, very little differences between applying Docker to something like a Rails app or a Flask app. And I think that's really good for a career path because, yeah, suddenly you don't just need to find a job or a contract where it's like specifically working with Rails or specifically Flask or something like that. You can kind of just go at any of them and kind of just apply the solutions there and just tweak them as needed. So yeah, lots of opportunities there. And really this is going to come down to personal preference, right? Do you want to be a contract worker or do you want to work somewhere full time? And yeah, there's plenty of things to learn around Docker that's not specific to Docker, but still like could technically be part of like a career path type of thing. Like, you know, maybe you're taking like an operations role or like a DevOps role, as a lot of people like to call it, or whatever, where, you know, you're kind of just working with deploying web applications, right? Where you could be learning stuff like Docker, you could be learning Kubernetes, you could be learning various different cloud platforms like DigitalOcean or AWS, a lot of infrastructure as code stuff, like if you're using Ansible, Terraform, yeah, there's all sorts of different tools out there now. And, you know, also just getting used to working with CI/CD pipelines. This is a very, very popular career path, and there is tons of stuff to learn. And this is actually like, you know, sort of what I'm doing now current day. So I still do application development, but I focus a lot of my time now on deployment, using all of those tools and more.
Now, for career in Docker and DevOps, I have two follow-up questions. Now, the first one is, for a person who are considering to get into become a DevOps engineer, you know, do you see any challenges for working as a DevOps engineer? What are some things that we should be aware of, right? For people who are trying to transition from a software developer to a DevOps. And my second question, you know, is why did you lean towards DevOps? Now, you've been a developer before, and you're also a DevOps, or, you know, Docker captain. Can you also talk about, you know, why did you shift the focus from development to DevOps?
Those are great questions. And let's start with the challenges of becoming a DevOps engineer or something like a site reliability engineer, which is a more specialized or subset version of that. And I think there's a number of different challenges to account for. But for me, let's start with the biggest one, which is probably having to accept the fact that there is no one tool that you can use to basically deploy any organization's services in a way that works perfectly for them. Whereas I think it's a little bit more different than software development where, you know, you really can't get yourself into too much trouble if you decide that you want to use a web framework that has a lot of batteries included and best practices accounted for. For example, you know, if you prefer using Ruby, there's Ruby on Rails. If you like Python, there's Django. If you like PHP, there's Laravel. And, you know, these are basically the big three frameworks where, you know, a lot of very smart people have put together these frameworks. A lot of very successful applications have been built with them. And there is this golden path that you can follow. Basically, you just start with, you know, getting started with those, you know, many different guides that, you know, you can choose from, official documentation, community resources, etc. And you can build your application following these. And you're not really going to get too bogged down by, you know, implementation details for very low level things. You know, it's a little bit different than, you know, maybe if you wanted to use something like Flask instead of Django, where, you know, now you might need to start making decisions around like, well, you know, what form processing library should I use? You know, how are we going to deal with like CI SRF protection and stuff like that. These batteries included frameworks have all of that accounted for you. So yeah, you can just stay on the path, develop your application in the ways that they prefer based on really good conventions and design patterns. And, you're basically off to the races. Whereas, circling back to the DevOps world, there really isn't like that batteries included framework that you can just, take this one tool and then do stuff. So you need to be very comfortable doing a lot of R&D, basically research and development, trying different tools out, figuring out like the pros and cons versus all of them, and then putting them all together to solve a very specific problem for whatever organization or company that you're working at. So that is definitely one challenge. Another challenge too is when things go wrong, typically it is, I don't want to say like always catastrophic, but, let's just say like, the website goes down. Well, that is a very scary event because one, customers can no longer check out that website. If this is a big company, maybe they're like a $50 million company, they could be public, private, whatever. Having tens of thousands of customers not be able to access the site, like that puts a really big amount of pressure on you to be able to debug that problem in real time, like with the spotlight focused like right in your face. And that could be, a very intimidating thing. So it's going to be on you to basically create workflows and tooling to, help get notified and debug these things if and when they happen. And I feel like that is like a slightly different amount of pressure than what it's like to be a software developer. Now, you can totally release some feature into production and actually have issues where customers experience problems. But, unless something like really goes wrong, like it's probably just not going to take down the whole world. Like, for example, if you were tasked to build like a user registration system by your product manager or something like that, like you can just sit there on your laptop and develop this feature in total isolation. Like nobody's going to be looking at that code. You can make a million mistakes and no one is going to see that. And then when you're ready to push it up for testing or whatever, I'm kind of skimming over details about like CI/CD pipelines, etc. But eventually, you're going to push it up and it's going to get rolled out to production and there it is. So like the majority of the work was done offline in the privacy of your own laptop. And, if something goes wrong, like, maybe users can't reset their password for some reason, while that is a very important thing, it's not like a catastrophic event where like everyone is going to be focused on that because, for everyone who doesn't need to reset their password, like the site still works. And yeah, I feel like you have a lot more leeway to fix bugs like that on your own. Whereas with the app side of things, like oftentimes it's like, well, either the site isn't working or there's some downtime event due to like maybe a cloud provider that you can't even control. And now you have to like figure out like what to do to make things more resilient in the future. And, maybe instead of just downtime, perhaps like 50% of users are seeing like, 10-second load times instead of 100 millisecond load times. Like what's wrong with that? And yeah, there's just a lot of like live debugging. And I don't know, I find that to be pretty challenging, but also kind of exciting in a way because I don't know, like ever since I was a little kid, like dealing with making things more efficient has always been some like underlying like core ethos to me as a human being. So I love the idea of being able to basically like automate myself out of the job. So like I want to build like the best tooling and workflow that I can possibly do so that when things go wrong, it's like as easy as possible to get that solution. And, the second part of the question you asked me, I think was like what led me towards becoming, more into like operations or just like deployments in general versus software development. And, I just want to be super clear that I still really, really, really enjoy building web applications and still do. But yeah, I'm definitely focusing more time just on the operation side of things. And what's really neat about that though is it's not like a light switch where it's like, or, a line where you're on one side versus the other. I actually do find that I very much exercise the same like programming skill sets that I do in the operation side, because like you still are technically programming things like, I could just be writing shell scripts or Python scripts or, figuring out how to do configuration management with like infrastructure as code. Like there's lots of like parts of my brain where I feel like I'm absolutely doing the same things that I was doing with software development. It's just instead of developing like application features, it's more lower level things to just like automate the setting up and provisioning of infrastructure. And, in a DevOps role, it's also a lot more than that. It's also kind of weird. Like, I kind of don't like the term like a DevOps engineer because like DevOps to me is more of just like policies and like philosophies, not like a thing that you just are. But yeah, I guess like another component, like this is also super dependent on where you work, but part of your role there as like a quote unquote DevOps engineer, it may not just be like setting up infrastructure like that. It could also be really like optimizing the developer's tooling, like any like scripts or tools that you can write to make the developers and your team more productive. Like that could be a very big aspect of what you do. And that is a very important thing. Also, just generally like improving code quality, like making sure you're using linting and code formatting and consistency and testing and setting up CI/CD pipelines and all this other great stuff. Like that stuff also really, really excites me because it feels like you become like an amplifier for whatever organization that you're working for around just like efficiency and productivity, right? If a developer or if a team has like 10 developers and you can save every developer like 2 hours a week of time through like automated stuff, suddenly that starts to like really add up, and it's like you become more important than like your own output, right? Like you just become an amplifier and things scale up really nicely. So yeah, I don't know. Plus from the operation side of view, like just learning a little bit more about Linux and like, various low-level networking things on cloud providers, that stuff to me is like really super interesting. So like the last year or so, I've been working with Kubernetes, and that's been to me like a fantastic journey of just like learning all sorts of new stuff. I feel like I've basically unlocked like a new world to explore, while still like similar enough to where, my previous skill set as a developer like totally applies. So yeah, I mean, this is a pretty long answer for this one, but yeah, I'm super excited about moving forward, doing more infrastructure stuff, while also continuing to be a software developer as well.
Can you also talk about your YouTube channel? What content did you post on there, and then talk more about what is it about?
My YouTube channel is kind of all over the place, so I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but the way I look at it is I am a human being. It's like I'm a software developer who likes to build and deploy things using many different technologies, and I find that a lot of the YouTube videos that I create, I sort of kind of don't just like invent a video idea for the sake of it, or, try to optimize my YouTube channel to get as many views as possible. I kind of just work through things as they go. And like, if I learn something cool on Tuesday, then when it comes time to record a video on Friday or something like that, then I'll just record the video about that cool thing that I learned, and then I'll post that video every week. Basically, every Tuesday is when I post a video. But, what this ends up translating to is, I do keep the channel very focused to just software developer stuff. I'm not just like introducing like how to cook rice or something like that. But yeah, I mean, it could be anything from tweaking Vim to like doing shell scripting stuff, or maybe some Docker stuff or Flask or Rails or any web front end stuff like working with Tailwind CSS. Like there's all sorts of different topics, and all of these topics basically come down to like what I'm actively working on. So
awesome. So this is it for this video, and thank you very much for Nick to be on this show, and also the audience to watch this far. If you like this content, if you want me to introduce different guests to explore different careers or stories or journeys in tech industry, please consider to like this video and also subscribe to this channel. I will try to have more guests, more different perspective coming very, very soon.